murder for the death of his 6-year-old friend Tiffany Unick. In his plea, he reverts back to a pre-defense counsel version of the events of that night. He states that, while they were playing, he stormed down the stairs and landed on Tiffany. You may recall that at that time, Tiffany weighed a slight 48 pounds and Lionel 178, standing almost 6 feet tall. The January 2003 plea saw Lionel receive time served for the years he had already been incarcerated. He left the juvenile prison at Okeechobee with an ankle bracelet and immediately began serving 1-year house arrest. He was also required to complete 10 years of probation along with 1,000 hours community service and undergo counseling for anger and grief. In September 2004, Lionel was found to be in possession of a knife in the middle of the night, violating both curfew and the terms of his release. As a result, his probation was extended to 15 years, according to the New York Times. Lionel was living with a different family at this time, and they requested he be removed from their care, citing the frequency of visits by probation as overwhelming. He went back to live with his mother, Kathleen, now as a 17-year-old young man. Approximately 9 months later, in May 2005, a now 18-year-old Lionel Tate was arrested for attempting to rob a pizza delivery man at gunpoint at an apartment complex in Pembroke Pines, Florida. Fingerprints on evidence at the scene, along with incriminating texts and eyewitness identification, made the case against him substantial. Jim Lewis, once again his attorney, believed that Lionel was simply an easy target, although he was identified by both the victim and the resident of the apartment where the robbery occurred. In December 2005, the next hearing in this case was postponed for a psychiatric evaluation when Lionel alerted the court that he was suicidal and hearing voices. Within a few weeks, a brain scan as well as a psychiatric evaluation had been concluded, and competence was ruled. Defense lawyers even admitted that their now adult client had lied about his psychological issues in an effort to delay the hearing and, by extension, the possibility that he may have to return to prison for life. In March 2006, Lionel Tate pled guilty to robbing the pizza delivery man, along with violation of probation, although he did attempt to withdraw these pleas before sentencing. The maximum sentence for both combined would have been 30 years in prison. Ultimately, Judge Lazarus leveled a sentence of 30 years in just the probation violation case alone and set a trial date on the armed robbery case. Lionel would eventually have a 10-year sentence added to be served concurrently after accepting a plea and avoiding a jury trial that would have carried yet another possible life sentence in prison. In the fall of 2011, reporter Michelle Gillen interviewed a then 24-year-old Lionel Tate from within the walls of the Suwannee Correctional Institution in Florida. They had been corresponding over the previous year, a year which had seen Lionel spend time in solitary confinement at his previous prison, a year which he says also included a suicide attempt and that culminated in his transferring facilities. Lionel contends that he feels bad about what happened, both back at the time of Tiffany's murder as well as when this interview is being conducted. He shared a few fond memories of their friendship and offered his desire to be forgiven by her mom. He concludes the interview with his final explanation for what happened in July 1999. "We were playing, and I guess I was rough, and she passed away." This was the most complete explanation from Lionel Tate regarding the unnecessary, brutal beating of exuberant 6-year-old Tiffany, his friend and playmate. More than a decade removed from his senseless crime, that was the totality of his recollection of the events of July 28, 1999. Lionel Tate is currently 30 years old and housed at Everglades Correctional Institution in Miami, Florida, with his concurrent 30 plus 10-year sentences for probation violation and armed burglary slated to end with his release on September 16, 2030. The tragic death of Tiffany Unick and the trial of Lionel Tate created widespread ripples throughout the entirety of the criminal justice system in this country. As mentioned earlier, Tate was the youngest juvenile ever to receive a life without parole sentence. We must remember that although the grand jury indicted Lionel on first-degree murder charges, they most certainly had the chance to indict him on a lesser charge, taking mandatory life off the table. However, they did not. In 2016, a panel of 7 convened at the Broward County Crime Commission's Conference on Juvenile and Adolescent Violence, which included the prosecutor in the Tate case, Ken Padowitz, Lionel's original defense attorney, Jim Lewis, along with the presiding judge, Joel Lazarus. All 3 have had long-lasting regrets regarding this case. Upon reflection, defense attorney Jim Lewis regrets becoming too close to his client, admittedly taking on a more fatherly role since he felt Lionel had never had one. The prosecutor regrets leaving it all up to the grand jury. Judge Lazarus regrets not dealing with the issues of competency head-on from the beginning. The panel feels as though Tate's abnormally early institutionalization led him to dive deeper toward more run-ins with law enforcement as he grew older. They also stated that the Florida justice system simply was not equipped at that time to handle such a violent crime perpetrated by a child. They do, however, recognize that this case did have an impact on legislation nationwide, leading to punishments and rehabilitation that are considered to be more age-appropriate. At trial, defense attorney Jim Lewis specifically stated that shows such as the UPN's WWE SmackDown were influencing factors in Tiffany Unick's death. The following is the WWE's statement, which was released in response to the defense's allegations and Lionel Tate's verdict and trial. We at the WWF believe that the verdict and the public statements made by individual jurors unanimously support our position that professional wrestling should have never been involved in this case. Sadly, an innocent little girl has died. Lionel Tate, by his own actions and the actions and decisions of his mother and defense attorney, have changed his life forever. The WWF has stated consistently that the suggestion that wrestling had anything to do with Lionel Tate's murderous acts was a contrived hoax. The jury easily and quickly repudiated the defense counsel's claim that pro wrestling was somehow to blame for the intentional homicide, and individual jurors have reiterated this in public comments. The evidence proved, and the jury found, that this was death caused not by mimicking wrestling moves, but rather by deliberate, prolonged, and savage beating. Shockingly, the senseless murder of Tiffany would not be the only time that professional wrestling moves would be blamed for the violent actions of a teenage boy. Tragically, in Terrytown, Louisiana, in June 2013, 5-year-old Villode Lewis died while being babysat by her 13-year-old half-brother, Armstrong DesVallons. Their mother went to the store, leaving the little 5-year-old in the care of her older half-sibling. By the time she returned home from running errands, paramedics had responded to Armstrong's 911 call stating that he had found his little sister on the bathroom floor. During the follow-up investigation, authorities discovered that Armstrong was babysitting, making him their now primary focus. Armstrong had told them that his sister had complained of a stomachache and went upstairs to the bathroom so she could brush her teeth. More than 30 minutes elapsed, and he realized she had not returned. He went to check on her and found her laying in pain on the bathroom floor. Armstrong then told police that he walked his little sister to the couch where she lay down. This is technically where she was when he noticed she wasn't breathing and called 911. Dispatchers had him initiate CPR and paramedics arrived, followed by the kid's mother. Tiny, precious Volode was soon pronounced dead at the hospital. On the day of the crime, her little body showed no outward signs of trauma, and her death was ruled undetermined. It wasn't until the following day, during the second interrogation session with police, that Armstrong admitted that he used so-called professional wrestling moves on Volode that they had seen on TV. It wasn't until the following day, during the second interrogation session with police, that Armstrong admitted that he had used so-called pro wrestling moves on Volode that they had seen on TV. He graphically described picking her up, slamming her on the bed, dropping elbows on her, punching her in the stomach 15 to 20 times, performing violent moves on her such as the John Cena slam, and jumping on her for an additional 2 to 3 minutes after she told him he was hurting her. He was interrupted only by a phone call from their mother. Armstrong DesVallons was born in Haiti. His mother left their native country when he was 4 years old, emigrating to the U.S. and leaving Armstrong to live with his father until the age of 10. Following the devastating earthquake in 2010, Armstrong emigrated to the U.S. alone under the sponsorship of Vilger Lewis, his new stepfather, who was a U.S. citizen, and father to his little sister Volode. Like Lionel Tate, Armstrong spent considerable parts of his childhood separated from the love, care, comfort, and protection of his mother, likely suffering great trauma during the horrors of a devastating natural disaster. Following Armstrong's charges in Volode's death, her father, Vilger Lewis, would state that, should Armstrong be sentenced to probation, he would not be allowed to return to their home, and went so far as to threaten to revoke his sponsorship, leaving Armstrong subject to deportation back in Haiti. He called him disrespectful. Ultimately, these issues were irrelevant as Armstrong DesVallons was sentenced to 3 years in juvenile prison for negligent homicide. The judge was adamant in his belief that Armstrong had to have known that he was hurting his little sister. Back on the day following Volode's murder, detectives interviewing Armstrong noted that, although he admitted to knowing that the wrestling moves he saw on TV were fake, he smiled and seemed to enjoy describing performing moves such as the Mark Henry slam on his little sister, even with the knowledge that he ultimately beat her to death. According to readily available information on the internet, Armstrong DesVallons would have been eligible for release from juvenile prison last year, 2016. In response to the news of their potential blame in the heartbreaking death of 5-year-old Volode Lewis, in June 2013, the WWE states that her death was a tragedy and our condolences go out to her family. WWE urges restraint in reporting this unfortunate incident as if it were the result of a WWE wrestling move. As in similar cases, criminal intent to harm and a lack of parental supervision have been the factors resulting in a tragic death. Authorities have already charged the accused with second-degree murder and determined that this was not an accidental death due to a wrestling move. Upon sentencing, the WWE released this statement. The death of Volode Lewis is a tragedy, and we express our condolences. WWE supports Judge Jansen's summation that the 13-year-old boy absolutely knew that he was hurting his 5-year-old little sister. Therefore, it is illogical